This is part 6 of ASP.NET Web Services tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss calling an ASP.NET Web Service from JavaScript using ASP.NET Ajax. This is what we want to achieve by the end of this video. We want to design a web form that looks like this, where we can enter a student ID, and once we click this button Get a Student, we want this web form to call an ASP.NET Web Service. And we want this web form to invoke that web service from JavaScript using ASP.NET Ajax. And the web service is going to retrieve data from a database table and then return that data to the web form. The web form should then obviously display those values within the respective text box controls. Let's see how to achieve this. Obviously, the first step here is to create a students table and populate it with some sample data. And here is the SQL script which can do that. I'll have the script available on my blog in case you need it. And next we need to create a stored procedure that can retrieve student information by their ID. And this is the stored procedure that does exactly the same thing. The name of the stored procedure is sp_get_student_by_id, and obviously this stored procedure has got a parameter which is nothing but the ID of the student. And the implementation is straightforward, a single select statement which is going to return these columns, that is ID, name, gender and total marks from this table, where ID equals whatever ID that we are passing into this stored procedure. Now let's flip to Visual Studio. So the first step here is to add a student class to encapsulate student information. So we need to create a student class that's going to contain ID, name, gender and total marks properties. So let's flip to Visual Studio, add a class file, and let's name it student.cs. And to speed things up, I have already implemented this student class. So let's copy and paste this code here. So very simple, straightforward properties. All of them are auto implemented. We've got ID, name, gender and total marks. The next step is to add a web service. So let's add a new item, and we want to add a web service. Let's select web from installed templates, scroll all the way down and select web service, and let's call this web service student service.asmx. Let's click add. Now we want to write some ADO.NET code within this web service so that it can go ahead and retrieve data from this table TBL students. So let's go ahead and import the required ADO.NET namespaces. We need system.data, we need system.data.sql client, and we need system.configuration. Let's also change the name of this method from hello world to get student by ID, and we need to pass it a parameter, that is the student ID, and we want this function to return a student object. So the first step here is to retrieve the connection string from web.config file. Within the web.config file of this project, I already have a connection string named dbcs, which is pointing to sample database on my local machine. So let's go ahead and use our configuration manager class. Configuration manager.connection strings of the name of the connection string is dbcs. Connection string should give us that. The next step is to create a SQL connection object. So SQL connection, let's call it con new SQL connection, and let's pass the connection string. And now let's create SQL command object. Let's call it cmd equals new SQL command. We want the SQL command object to execute this stored procedure get student by ID. So let's pass the name of the stored procedure, and then we also need to specify the connection object. And we know that this command is a stored procedure, so we have to tell the command object that. So command.command type equals command type.stored procedure. And this stored procedure also expects a parameter, and the name of the parameter is @id. So we need to create a SQL parameter object. So let's call it parameter equals new SQL parameter. And let's use this overloaded version where we can specify the name of the parameter and the value. So the value is going to come into this method as a parameter. So let's go ahead and pass it. as the value for the parameter object. Finally, we need to associate this parameter object with the command object, and to do that, command.parameters.add, and we need to open the connection and execute the command.executeReader. So executeReader is going to return a SQL data reader object. So let's create a variable of type SQL data reader, and let's call it reader. And before you open the connection, let's also create a student object. Let's call it student equals new student, while rdr.read. So as we read data, we want to retrieve the respective column values and then populate the properties of the student object. So student.id equals, where are we going to get the ID from? From the reader. So let's specify the name of the column. So the name of the columns matches the names of the properties. So student.id equals reader of ID, and this ID property is an integer, so we need to convert this to an integer. So let's go ahead and do that. Convert dot to int 32, and we need to populate student name. Student name is string, so reader of name, and let's convert that to string. So student dot gender, and the column name is gender. And finally, we need to populate total marks property. So student dot total marks equals reader of total marks. And then once that is done, we are going to return the student object. Very simple web service. All it has is some ADO.NET code which is going to retrieve data from TBL students table. Let's go ahead and test our web service to make sure it works as expected. So on this service page, we should see that getStudentById function. So there we have it, and this web service method expects a parameter. So let's go ahead and pass student ID as 1, invoke it, and look at that, we get the response back from the web service. We have the ID, name, gender, and total marks. Alright, so now let's see how to invoke this web service from a web form from JavaScript using ASP.NET Ajax. So let's flip to Visual Studio. So the first step here is to add a web form. So let's go ahead and add a web form. Now we want to design this web form so that it looks like this. And to speed things up, I have already implemented the required HTML. So let's copy it from this notepad. And paste it in our web form. Let's format this properly by selecting the entire HTML and pressing Ctrl K and D. So this is straightforward HTML. All I have here is a table, and then it has got some tr tags. Within that I have, two TDs in every row. So that's the text, and those are the text boxes. Now at the moment we don't have this button control, so let's go ahead, drag and drop the button control. Now we don't want to do a post back to the server. We want to call the web service from JavaScript using ASP.NET Ajax. Now if we use the button control, that is the ASP.NET button control, when we click the button, it's going to post the page back to the server. Now we don't want that to happen. Instead, we are going to use the HTML input button control, so which is present under HTML tab. So we are going to use this one. Let's actually flip to the source mode and add it next to the text box control. So the value on that button is going to be get student. Okay. Now There are three steps that we need to be aware of to call a web service from JavaScript using ASP.NET Ajax. The first step is to decorate the web service class with script service attribute. Okay, so this enables a web service to be callable from JavaScript. Okay, so let's flip to Visual Studio. Let's go to our student service, and if you look at the auto-generated code here, look at this, it's already decorated with that script service attribute, but then this is commented, and there's a comment as well here to allow this web service to be called from script using ASP.NET Ajax. Uncomment the following line. So let's uncomment this. So if you want your web service to be callable from JavaScript, then that web service needs to be decorated with script service attribute that's present in system.web.script.services namespace. Alright, the second step is to include a script manager control on the web form itself from where we want to call the web service, and then we need to specify the path for the student web service that we want to invoke. So let's flip to our web form, and then let's drag and drop script manager control, and you can find script manager control under Ajax extensions. So within the script manager control, we need to specify services element, and within that we need to specify service reference, and then set the path for our student service. And where is our student service present? Within the root directory of this project. And how do we specify root directory? // and we have got the student service.asmx. Alright, so that's the second step. And what is the third step? We need to implement the required JavaScript functions to invoke the web service method. So we need to write some JavaScript code. Let's write that within the head section of the web form. So let's specify the script tag. So script type equals text/JavaScript, and language is JavaScript. So here we are going to write a JavaScript function. Let's call it getStudent by ID. So in order to call the web service method, we first need the ID of the student. And where are we going to get the ID of the student from? From this text box control on the web form. So what is the ID of that text box control on the web form? It's called txt_student_id. So using JavaScript, we need to retrieve the value from the text box, and in order to do that, we use the document object. So document.getElementById. So what is the ID of the element? txt_student_id. And then dot value is going to return the value that is present within the text box control. Let's store it in a variable called ID, and then all that is left is to invoke the web service method. So if you look at our student service, it's actually present in this namespace, web services demo. So here we need to specify the fully qualified name, web services demo dot the name of the web service, which is student service, and finally the name of the web method itself. So the web method name is getStudentById, and obviously this method expects an ID value, so let's pass it. Okay, we also need to specify another parameter to this function. Now obviously, when this method is called, the web service will be invoked. So the web service will retrieve data from the database table, and it's going to return the result. So once the result is returned, we need another JavaScript function which is going to retrieve those results and then display within the UI controls. Okay, now here we are calling the web service asynchronously. Okay, so we call a web service and then we can do other things as well. And then when the web service finishes executing that method, it's going to call into a callback function that we are going to specify here. And that callback function is going to receive the result from the web service, and then it's the responsibility of that callback function to update the UI elements. Okay, so let's specify the function here. Let's call it getStudentById success callback. You can give it any name you want, but then this is the function that gets called when the web service returns successfully. So now we need to implement that function. So function get student by ID success callback. So obviously this function is going to receive the result from the web service, and this is the parameter which is going to receive that results. Again, you can give it any meaningful name you want. I happen to just choose results. Okay, so what we need to do inside this function, we need to populate these UI controls, that is name, gender, and total marks text boxes. Okay, and we obviously have IDs for them. So txt name, gender, and total marks. So document dot get element by ID. So what's the ID of name? Txt name. So let's copy it. Let's go back and paste it right there. So txt name dot value equals from this results. So this results should have name within it, that is returned from the web service. In a similar fashion, we need txt gender, and the property name is going to be gender, and similarly txt total marks. That's it, we're done. So let's go ahead and test our web form to make sure it calls the web service as expected. So let's enter an ID of 1, click the button get student. Look at that, nothing happens. Why is that? That's basically because we have implemented our JavaScript functions, but we haven't told this button to actually call this JavaScript function. Okay, so we need to tell that. So here we have the button control. So on click of the button, we want to call this function get student by ID. So let's specify the function name right here. Alright, so let's run this one more time. Enter student ID, click get student. Look at that, we get the respective student. Let's enter number 5, get student, and we get the data as expected. Okay, now at the moment, if we enter some garbage, something like test, that's not a valid student ID. When I click get student, look at that, nothing happens. It basically fails silently. We need to give some kind of update to the user stating that this is invalid for integer. Okay, so in order to do that, we can pass another parameter to this function. Here we are calling get student by ID. That's the parameter that we pass, and this is the method that gets executed when the web service call successfully returns. On the other hand, if the web service call fails for some reason, then we can specify another function to call back. Okay, so let's call it get student by ID failed callback. So this is the function which is going to be called when the web service call fails. So let's implement that function here. So function get student by ID failed callback, and obviously when the call fails, there are going to be some errors. So this parameter is going to receive those errors. Again, you can give this parameter any name you want, and let's simply show an alert box, alert, and we want to show the errors. So errors dot, there's a function called get underscore message, which is going to return those errors. So let's go ahead and run this and see if it works as expected. So let's enter test. That's not a valid ID. Look at that, test is not a valid value for integer 32. Okay, on the other hand, if we enter a valid ID, it works as expected. Alright, now here, look at this. When we click this button, we are not actually posting the entire page back to the server. When we click this button, the web service will be called asynchronously, and the page will be updated. Only this portion of the page will be updated. So here, we are not doing a full page post back. It's only a partial page post back. Okay, let's actually do the prove that when we click this button, we are doing partial page post back and not a full page post back. And to do that, let's include an h1 tag after the table, and then let's specify some text there. So let's include this text. The time below doesn't change, so basically the time below does not change when we click get student button, as we are doing partial page post back and not a full page post back. And let's include a label control here, and let's include an ASP.NET label control, and let's call it LBL time, and let's get rid of this text from here. And within the code behind file, on the page load event, let's set the current date and time. So datetime dot now dot toString. So let's actually run this. So when the web form loads, look at that, the time currently is this one, okay, 19:30:52. Now look at this, when we enter an ID and click get student, look at that, the page is not posted back and the time doesn't change. That's, that proves it. So only this portion of the page is updated. So here we are doing a partial page post back. We're calling the web service from JavaScript using ASP.NET Ajax. Alright, with that, some of the YouTube subscribers have asked a few questions after watching the initial videos in this web services tutorial. I thought I'll clarify them right now. So here are those questions. The first question is, could you explain how an object-oriented application such as ASP.NET Web Application can make use of web services to access a relational database? Now, we have discussed exactly the same thing here. So here we have this web form. This web form calls the web service, and within the web service we have ADO.NET code which calls into the relational database, retrieves data, and then give it back to the web form. So that's what we have discussed. Now, just like an ASP.NET web application, a web service can work with any type of data store, not just relational databases. It can work with XML files, text files, Microsoft Access, Excel, etc. Now, another question that I have got is, where does ADO.NET and XML web services come in the architecture of the application? Now, most of the real-time applications have 3 or more layers, and the most common layers in most of the applications are, user interface or presentation layer, which is basically responsible for the UI logic, and business logic layer. It contains logic to validate business roles, and data access layer, which is responsible for performing the database CRUD operations, that is create, read, update, and deletes. Now, with respect to this architecture, web services belong to the business logic layer, and ADO.NET obviously belong to data access layer. And this is the final question that I have got: how to call a web service from the web form without reloading the entire web page. This question can also be asked in a different form: how to call a web service without full page post back. Call the web service using ASP.NET Ajax, which allows partial page post back, and we have seen that in action just now. So with partial page postbacks, only a specific portion of the page is updated without reloading the entire page, which is better for performance and also avoids screen flickers. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.